Show, a bi-weekly podcast on the ever-changing world of natural refrigerants, brought to you by Shecco, with support from component maker Teco. Today, we will be discussing the major news items impacting the world of natural refrigerants. My name is Michael Garry, editor of Shecco's Accelerate America magazine and North American editor for Shecco, and I will be hosting today's podcast from Shecco's New York area bureau outside of New York City. I'm joined today by my colleague in Brussels, Belgium, Charlotte McLaughlin, who is the multimedia reporter based in Brussels. Hello, Charlotte.
Hi, Michael. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. We'll also hear from our Asia Pacific reporter based in Tokyo, Devin Yoshimoto. So today we will be discussing a few US-related items, namely ALDI's latest figures on the number of transcritical installations it has and the status of the California Cooling Act. We'll hear from Charlotte about the Metro's first CO2 transcritical store in Russia and one of the first in that country. And then we'll hear some news from the China Symposium on CO2 from Devin. So we'll start with the United States, where I'm pleased to report that ALDI US is now up to 130 stores with transcritical CO2, which is almost twice the number of stores that they had a year ago. And they're not finished. They are really just getting started. They have a lot, they're constantly expanding and remodeling their stores, so there are more to come. Most of these transcritical units are supplied by Hill Phoenix.
And in the US, is it every single store that they open is a transcritical CO2 store?
That's correct. There are new stores that they're opening are CO2 transcritical, as well as many refurbished stores they're putting the transcritical systems in. So they continue to have more stores with transcritical systems than any other U.S. food retailer. They are the leader. I wrote about this last year in an article called Leader of the Rack. And many of these, they have many transcritical units based in Southern California, a warm climate where they use adiabatic condensing to address the warmer ambience and the efficiency issues that come up. And speaking of California, the other story I wanted to get into was the status of the California Cooling Act. Of course, that is an act proposed by State Senator Ricardo Lara, who was Accelerate America's Person of the Year in 2018. He introduced the California Cooling Act in February of this year, and notably, it's an act that would create financial incentives for natural refrigerant systems installed in California. So a company like ALDI would be able to take advantage of that. The bill is now before the state legislature's Assembly Appropriations Committee, and that committee will likely vote on the bill on August 17th.
After it gets voted on by the Appropriations Committee, does it move somewhere else? Is it voted on the Senate or House floor, for instance?
Yeah, so approved by the Appropriations Committee, there'd have to be a final action on the bill by the Assembly, which is expected by the end of August. The Senate has already approved of the act. It was passed by the Senate in May. It's also been approved by the Assembly's Natural Resources Committee in June. So, but the key here is that And I should add first that this bill targets end users of supermarket refrigeration, cold storage equipment, and commercial air conditioning systems. So Senator Lara, and this is a very key point, he's continuing to welcome letters of support for the California Cooling Act from industry stakeholders. And he needs those by August 8th, which is next Wednesday. So if you live in California and you would like to see incentive funding available for natural refrigerant projects in the supermarket and cold storage business, you should send a letter of support to the following email address: Mike.Peterson, Peterson, at sen.ca.gov. Let me repeat that: Mike.Peterson at sen.ca.gov. .gov. These will be helpful to demonstrate the breadth of businesses that are interested in low GWP cooling solutions. Of course, this applies particularly to California, but I would suggest anybody listening would be it would be appropriate to send letters of this sort of support, because what happens in California, has global repercussions. And if they set up an incentive program there, it would be used as a model for other states and even other countries to supply these kinds of financial incentives for natural refrigerant installations. Now over to Charlotte.
Hi, Michael. So the second CO2 transcritical store in Russia opened its doors last week. So this store is, this supermarket is owned by Metro. So the Metro Group, and it's their first CO2 transcritical store in Russia. And before, the only supermarket in Russia using CO2 that we know of is Magnet. And this was kind of a project done by Dan Foss and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. So it was more of a project, a test, more of like basically showing the technology in Russia, whereas this comes from Metro, and it's part of their F-gas strategy. So Metro is basically trying to reduce their emissions of F-gases, and they kind of want to completely phase out F-gases in their stores by 2030 and replace them with natural refrigerants. So this is their aim, to do this by 2030. And so the store in Russia is kind of is another part of their plan, basically. They have just opened this one store in APAC, so it's near Moscow. And so this will be their one transcritical store. They have 25 subcritical CO2 stores and one ammonia cold storage center in Russia now. And then they will open another store in Russia soon, also near Moscow. So they will have two CO2 transcritical stores.
It's interesting that they're doing this because I believe they opened one of the first transcritical stores in China not that long.
Yeah, they opened the first in China.
Right. So they're really pushing the envelope in these countries around the world, very large countries, to try to introduce this technology in those marketplaces, which is very interesting and encouraging. I'm sure that these are huge marketplaces where there's a lot of HFC gases and probably still R22 type gases still being used, but these countries are all part of the Kigali Amendment, and will ultimately probably participate in the phase down of HFCs, so they will need alternatives like CO2. And so it's encouraging that this is happening. And kudos to Metro, which of course has a lot of these CO2 systems in Europe.
Yeah, they do. So yeah, in Europe they're really going ahead with their CO2 transcritical plan. And they're a German wholesale retailer, so they have quite a lot of the stores in Germany running on CO2 now. What's really unique about this installation is that it was installed by a local installer, Ingeum. So it's kind of nice that it's not coming from like outside help, like Europeans or I don't know, German companies going there to provide the CO2, and they actually made the two CO2 racks that are used to refrigerate the 6,547 square meter cash and carry. So it's nice that it's also encouraging local development in Russia as well.
Excellent. I hope. And when is the next one going in?
Yeah, Odinstova will follow in August and Solenstova in December. So by the end of this year, Metro will have 3 CO2 transcritical stores in in Russia.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Charlotte. We're now going to hear from Devin, going to talk about events at the China Symposium on CO2.
So I'm here with Devin Yoshimoto, our Asia Pacific correspondent, and he's going to talk about the CO2 conference that you attended in China. What were like the highlights from the conference, and can you give me some like background information about it as well? It's the second time they've held this, right?
Yeah, that's right. This is the second time they've held this event. The first time they held it last year in September in Tianjin. And this time they held it in Hefei, about an hour flight away from Shanghai. And so the name of this conference is the International Symposium on Natural Gas CO2 Refrigeration and Heat Pump Technology. And it's put on by a number of organizations, mainly the UN organizations, so UNDP, UNIDO, and UNEP, in cooperation with the Chinese Ministry of Environment, and also some other agencies like GIZ, and also a local company called the GMRI, General Machinery Institute. Sorry, I don't remember the exact name right now, but all these stakeholders have come together to put on this conference to talk about how to push forward and accelerate the adoption of CO2 technology in China. So one of the biggest things I saw while I was there, as you know, we flew out. It was held just this past Monday and Tuesday, on the 30th and 31st of July. And we flew out and we presented as shecco to give the latest updates as that have come across news-wise around the world for CO2. But one of the biggest things we learned while we were out there was that they're really trying to push for CO2 use in a lot of different sectors in China, so especially the industrial sector and also for residential sectors like heat pumps for heating and cooling.
Is this like just domestic hot water production, or is this also heat pumps for heating your home?
Yeah. Well, one of the main applications they talked about was for heating your home, because one of the biggest issues they're facing now is China officially, as a matter of governmental policy, is moving away from burning coal. Because this is one of the biggest releases of emissions, CO2 emissions, especially in the countryside and rural areas of China. And one of these presentations was done by a university professor, because a lot of representatives and professors from different universities in China were presenting about the latest developments with CO2 technology. And one opportunity was found for CO2 heat pumps for heating, especially residential. So a lot of the things were detailed with that technology. And one of the persons presenting was Professor Ma Yitai from Tianjin University. And one of the things he identified that was one of the biggest barriers was the cost of the technology, which was a main theme of the conference. But his research showed that the compressors often were the biggest cost of these systems. And he said that if we can find a way to reduce the amount of cost for the compressors, you'll reduce the overall cost of the systems as a whole. And he was also very, very strong in his statements towards why the country saw such a big opportunity for CO2. And he said that there are new alternatives on the market, meaning new synthetic alternatives for refrigerants. But he said, but from the perspective of cost, it's very difficult to use these new materials. So, with these synthetic refrigerants, there's definitely a chance that they're going to be more expensive, especially when compared to CO2. And he said, that's why we're looking at CO2 as one of the best alternatives, alternative technologies for China. And so this was one of the main themes. The government was talking about how they're moving into the second stage of their HCFC phase-out management plan. Academia was talking about how far CO2 technology has come in terms of research, and efficiency, especially in warm climates, in different applications, also in mobile air conditioning. One of the professors was
All right, well, thanks very much. I guess people can check out the articles online, which I'm sure are coming from the conference. Thank you, Devin.
Well, that wraps up today's NatRefs show. I want to thank my colleagues, Charlotte and Devin, and thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time on the NatRefs show.